Sicily, August 1943. Inside a sweltering field hospital, American soldiers lay in rows. Some were missing limbs. Some had shrapnel still buried in their bodies. Some would never leave that tent alive. Then General George S. Patton walked in. He moved slowly between the rows, stopping to grip hands, to say something to the men who had bled for him. And then he stopped. In the corner of the tent sat a young soldier. No bandages, no wounds, no blood. He was simply sitting on a stool, trembling. Patton stared at him. The only sound was the distant roll of artillery. Then something shifted in Patton's face, and in front of every doctor, every nurse, every broken soldier in that tent, George Patton stepped forward and slapped the private across the face. What happened next would follow Patton for the rest of his life, and nearly cost America one of its most feared commanders in the middle of the war. To understand what happened in that tent, you need to understand the man who walked into it. Patton cultivated an almost mythic image: ivory-handled pistols, brutal discipline, relentless aggression. But the pistols, the lacquered helmet, the famous scowl, it was all theatre. Patton practiced his war face in the mirror for hours. He was a man deeply insecure about his own courage, terrified that if his men saw even a flicker of doubt in his eyes, the entire front line would collapse. He wasn't just fighting the Germans, he was fighting his own mind. He believed weakness could spread through an army like a disease. One frightened soldier could infect a platoon. One broken platoon could shatter a regiment. His men both worshipped and feared him. His commanders both needed and dreaded him. And on August 3rd, 1943, that performance turned lethal. Because Sicily had pushed Patton closer to the edge than anyone around him realized. The Allied invasion of Sicily was grinding forward at enormous cost. Temperatures above 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the interior. German and Italian defenders dug into the hillsides with mortars and artillery. American soldiers had been advancing under fire for weeks, sleeping in dirt, eating when they could, watching the men beside them die. In field hospitals across the island, medics were treating something they didn't fully have a name for yet. Men who shook uncontrollably, men who stared at nothing, men who simply sat down one day and couldn't get back up. The army called it battle fatigue. What they didn't yet understand was that they were watching human minds reach their absolute limit. But inside one field hospital on the morning of August 3rd, Patton was about to encounter something that, in his mind, he simply could not allow. Private Charles H. Cool was 27 years old. He came from Mishawaka, Indiana, a quiet Midwestern city most people had never heard of. He had been drafted, he had trained, he had shipped overseas. He had done everything his country asked of him. But by that August morning, something had broken inside him. He hadn't slept properly in days. The artillery had blended into one continuous roar that never fully left his head, even when the guns went quiet. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. He had been admitted to the 15th Evacuation Hospital with no visible combat wound. He simply told them he couldn't take the fighting anymore. His medical record read, psychoneurosis anxiety state, moderately severe. What Patton saw as cowardice, doctors were only beginning to understand. But there was something else, something the charts hadn't caught yet. When a nurse slipped a thermometer into Cool's mouth shortly after Patton stormed out of the tent that morning, the mercury spiked, 102.2 degrees Fahrenheit. Cool wasn't just mentally shattered. His blood was crawling with malaria and chronic dysentery. His body was physically consuming itself. The soldier Patton would accuse of faking was fighting a severe infection that would have hospitalized any man in that tent. Cool didn't know Patton was coming. He was simply sitting in the corner, trying to hold himself together. Then the tent flap opened.
Patton moved through the rows. He stopped at each stretcher. He shook hands, he called men by their units. And then he reached Cool. He looked him up and down. No wounds, no bandage, no injury he could see. "What's the matter with you?" Patton asked. Cool looked up. "I guess I just can't take it, sir." Something ignited. Patton grabbed him by the collar and slapped him across the face. The tent went still. Doctors froze. Nurses stopped moving. Every wounded man in that tent stared. Cool didn't fight back. He didn't say a word. He simply stared at the ground. Patton was screaming now, calling Cool a coward, threatening him, ordering him back to the front. He turned to the hospital's medical officer. "Don't you admit this yellow bastard," Patton reportedly said. "There's nothing wrong with him." He slapped Cool a second time, hard enough to knock his helmet liner off. Then he walked out. Behind him, the tent was absolutely silent, but the real damage hadn't begun yet.
You might think that would be the end of it. One terrible moment, a general under unbearable pressure, something that could perhaps be quietly buried in the chaos of a war. 11 days later, Patton did it again. On August 10th, he visited the 93rd Evacuation Hospital near Sant'Agata. There he found Private Paul Bennett, 21 years old, an artilleryman who had been at the front for 4 straight years. Bennett had begged his medical officers not to send him to the rear. He didn't want to leave his unit. He didn't want to look like a coward. But he had watched his closest friend get wounded right beside him, and his nerves had finally completely shattered. He was ordered to the hospital. He had no choice. Patton didn't care. He looked at the trembling 21-year-old and roared, "You filthy coward! I ought to shoot you myself!" Then he reached down and tore his ivory-handled pistol from his holster. He waved the loaded weapon directly at Bennett's face. He hit him hard across the head, hard enough that the medical logs record Bennett's helmet liner flying across the ward. That was the moment Colonel Donald Currier, the hospital's commanding officer, stepped his own body between a 3-star general and a bedridden patient. The man who had begged to stay at the front, the man who refused to abandon his unit, had just been called a coward at gunpoint. Now the incident could no longer be contained, and Patton had no idea it was already on its way to Washington. Word travelled fast. Hospital commanders filed formal reports. Those reports reached General Omar Bradley. Bradley was deeply disturbed by what he read. The reports then landed on the desk of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Mediterranean. And once those reports hit Eisenhower's desk, Patton's career suddenly stood on the edge. Eisenhower was furious. Not the way Patton was furious, loud and explosive. Eisenhower's fury was cold, measured, far more dangerous. He ordered Patton to personally apologize to both soldiers, to every officer and man at both hospitals, to the entire 7th Army. The Army wasn't just afraid of embarrassment, they were afraid of disaster, because removing Patton in the middle of a war could reshape the entire Allied command structure. 3 journalists who had heard accounts of the incidents sat on the story, partly out of wartime patriotism, partly because they believed Patton was too valuable to lose. For weeks they said nothing, but the story had a life of its own. In November of 1943, radio broadcaster Drew Pearson went on the air and told America exactly what had happened inside that tent. At the height of the Second World War, the United States suddenly faced an uncomfortable question. Had one of its greatest generals gone too far? The scandal was now spiraling far beyond the battlefield.
The public reaction was immediate. Calls flooded into newspapers. Congress demanded answers. Some called for Patton's court-martial. Some demanded his dismissal on the spot. Inside the Pentagon, the conversations reached the highest levels. Eisenhower faced an almost impossible calculation. Patton was, by any military measure, one of the most effective armoured commanders in the entire Allied order of battle. His Seventh Army had torn through Sicily at a pace that stunned even the Germans. But he had publicly assaulted soldiers under his command. He had drawn a loaded weapon inside a medical ward. If Eisenhower kept Patton, what did that say? If he removed Patton, what did the Allies lose? Eisenhower decided not to relieve him. But the price was steep. Patton was formally reprimanded, grounded, removed from any active operational role, and when the planning began for the greatest military invasion in history, Patton was not in the room. D-Day was coming, and what happened next was something nobody, least of all Patton, could have predicted. In the months that followed, Patton waited. He watched other commanders receive assignments that should have been his. Montgomery, Bradley. Patton sat on the sidelines. By every measure, it was a humiliation. But something extraordinary was happening. The Germans were watching. Their intelligence had studied Patton carefully, tracked his campaigns in North Africa and Sicily. Their conclusion: Patton was the most dangerous Allied general on the field. And the Allied High Command realized something remarkable. The man who had become a diplomatic catastrophe was the most feared name in the entire German military. So they built a lie around him, Operation Fortitude, a fictional army, the First United States Army Group, FUSAG, fake radio traffic, fake unit insignia, fake armored formations positioned for German reconnaissance aircraft to photograph. The message sent to Berlin: Patton is massing forces in southeastern England. The real invasion comes at Pas de Calais. The Germans believed it. Even after Allied forces were ashore in Normandy on D-Day, Hitler held his panzer reserves back for weeks, waiting for Patton, convinced the landings were a diversion. Those weeks may have saved thousands of Allied lives, purchased in part by the fear that a humiliated, grounded general still inspired in the enemy.
Private Charles Kuhl was treated. He recovered. He returned to duty. He survived the war. Years later, when reporters asked him about that August morning in Sicily, he surprised them. He said he bore no ill will toward Patton. He told his parents shortly after the incident to just forget about it. And then he said something that stopped historians cold. I think he was suffering a little battle fatigue himself at the time. Private Paul Bennett also survived. He went home. He lived his life. He never became a footnote in anyone's history book. George Patton commanded the Third Army across France and into Germany, one of the most celebrated armoured campaigns of the entire war. He died in December 1945 from injuries sustained in a traffic accident in occupied Germany. He never fully escaped the shadow of those two moments in the Sicilian heat. Decades later, historians began looking more carefully at Patton's own behaviour during those exact weeks in Sicily. The wild mood swings, the weeping spells during private dinners, the desperate, almost irrational need to push his men past human limits. And they arrived at a startling conclusion. Patton wasn't just disgusted by battle fatigue. He was likely fleeing from it himself. The man who slapped soldiers for breaking down was using every remaining ounce of his own sanity to keep from doing the exact same thing. Today, we understand what Charles Kuhl and Paul Bennett were experiencing. We call it post-traumatic stress. We recognize it as a real injury, not to the body, but to the mind. The science of 1943 did not understand that. The military culture of 1943 certainly did not. And even George Patton, brilliant, fearless, genuinely courageous in his own way, could not see past what his entire life had taught him to believe. That the mind, like the body, has limits. That those limits are not weakness. That pressure, applied long enough, breaks things that should never have been asked to bend that far. The slap never fully disappeared from Patton's legacy,
and neither did the question it raised. How much can the human mind endure before it breaks? And perhaps more uncomfortably, what do we owe the people we ask to find out? A new story every week. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Patton called Bennett a coward, but Bennett had begged to stay at the front. Who do you think was really breaking down in Sicily?